start off with our special guest, Dr. Robert Gates. He's got a great presentation for us. Give us a second. Those are online. If you'll hold your questions, don't worry about raising hands on the Zoom meeting. Just speak up after we get through the presentation, and he'll be more than happy to answer questions, I guess. Thank you, Dr. Gates. Let me get started here. Give me a second.
Dr. Freeman, give me a mic check real quick to make sure it's loud enough.
Hello, hello, hello. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Now?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
No.
Yes.
They can hear you online because the mic's here. It's not coming across. Did the battery go dead?
Okay, we're good now? Good.
Miles, you hear it all right? I mean, Dan?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. Sorry, Miles.
Are we ready?
Yes, sir.
Good. This talk I'm giving is a talk I gave at the history conference in Missouri. For reasons I don't understand, they've invited me to talk about Dahlgren for 4 years in a row. So if they didn't know anything about Dahlgren before, they do now. A little bit anyway. This is it's also based on a paper that's being published in the upcoming issue of the Northern Neck Virginia Historical Society magazine that'll come out this summer. So much more detail in that than I could cover in this talk. My study of leadership in Dahlgren history led me to the question posed in the title: was the success of the Navy in Dahlgren inevitable, or was it the result of visionary leadership? In my reading, I found a couple of ways to approach this question. One, Daniel Borston, a historian and former librarian of Congress, in his book, The American Democratic Experience, introduced the idea of momentum in history. He said, as events picked up velocity, they develop a life of their own and in a sense become inevitable. The example he used to make his case was Harry Truman deciding to use the atomic bomb at the end of World War II. His argument was that Harry Truman didn't decide to use the bomb as much as he did not decide not to use the bomb. That the expense and the effort that went into developing the bomb made its use basically inevitable. Borston acknowledged that physicists had worked on the problem for a couple of decades leading up to World War II. The Manhattan Project between spring of 1942 and summer of 45 spent in 1945 dollars $5 billion. Some estimates these in current dollars would be between 20 and 50 billion dollars. So there was a lot of effort that had gone into this, and Borston's argument it had become inevitable. There's a counter to that was presented by Eugene Lewis in his book Public Entrepreneurship Towards a Theory of Bureaucratic Power. He said subsequent events come about by the action of others. His example was the development of nuclear propulsion by Hyman Rickover. And he acknowledged what Borston did, that nuclear research had started a couple of decades earlier. He acknowledged the magnitude of the Manhattan Project, but he viewed nuclear propulsion as a logical follow-on, not as inevitable. And it wouldn't have happened without the efforts of Hyman Rickover and several others to bring it to fruition. It's not on this chart, but I came across a third way to look at this. Carl Weick, an organizational psychologist, developed his theory of sense-making, which is usually applied to strategic planning. But he said, when we look at where we are and try to make sense of the sequence of events that got here, what we tend to do is retrospectively create a myth that explains the sequence of events. And being humans, that myth usually makes things seem inevitable, whether they were or not in reality. Now, most of you will know a lot of this history about Dahlgren, but just to set the stage for the discussion, by about 1910, it was becoming obvious that the range of Indian Head was too short. You couldn't test the 14-inch guns that were the main battery on battleships at the time. You certainly weren't going to be able to test the 16-inch guns that were coming. So the Navy did what it usually did and created a committee. And they went out looking for a site, and they gave up without finding one. By 1917, it had become critical. There had been several accidents at Indian Head, and you could not test the 14-inch gun to its full extent at Indian Head. And so something needed to be done. And the commanding officer, another officer, went looking and came around Matthias Point and found Dahlgren. And so it was created as an auxiliary test range to Naval Proving Ground at Indian Head. And auxiliary does a lot of work in that phrase. It implied that headquarters of Naval Proving Ground was still at Indian Head. Auxiliary meant that there would be a small permanent staff at Dahlgren, few permanent buildings, and the range would only be used if the test being done required it. And in 1919, there were about 700 employees at Dahlgren. So if we jump ahead to 2026, now Dahlgren is the site of a Navy working capital fund laboratory that does almost $2 billion worth of business a year. And by some estimates, every day, nearly 10,000 contractor and government employees come through the gate. So how did Dahlgren get from an auxiliary test range to where it is now? And that's what brought up the question that I had been asking. Dahlgren's growth might look inevitable in hindsight, but there were a lot of bumps in the road. And I'm sure the people who lived through it didn't ever think it was inevitable. Woodrow Wilson signed the proclamation that bought the land in June of 1918. The first test at Dahlgren was done in October 16, 1918, of a Marine Corps 7-inch tractor gun. That gun was supposed to go to Europe after it was tested. And if you look at the calendar, the armistice that ended World War I was on November the 11th. The gun didn't go to Europe or anywhere else. It stayed at Dahlgren for many decades after that. But when World War I was coming to an end, there were two congressmen, Ambrose Stevens of Ohio and Sidney Mudd of Maryland. If you're interested, if you recognize the Mudd name, he was the great nephew of Dr. Mudd. This is a free factoid. But they decided that now that the war was ending and over, that they didn't need the range of Dahlgren anymore. So they set out to keep it from opening. They weren't successful, but they spent several years after that trying to close Dahlgren. And they did it by restricting funding to build facilities at Bureau of Ordnance sites, including Dahlgren. They instigated congressional investigations about money being spent at Dahlgren. And they weren't successful, but it went on until Stevens died in 1927. They weren't successful closing it, but they did have an effect. There were no buildings built at Dahlgren, and the workforce had dropped to about 200 during that time. But that wasn't the end of the challenge. It was merely the beginning. The U.S. in time of war has always been slow to mobilize and quick to demobilize when it's over. And World War II is no different. The defense budgets under Harry Truman in the 1940s were reduced by 85% from the peak during 1944 and 45. That's probably a little unfair because they were really high during 44 and 45, but the workforce was all, but the personnel was also reduced by that same percentage, both military and civilian. After Korea, Dahlgren was threatened with closure. The Navy guns hadn't played as big a role in Korea as aviation. And so there was some thought that maybe the time of Navy guns had passed. And if that were true, then you didn't need a place to test them at Dahlgren. So there was that theory that maybe Dahlgren would be closed. There was a number of studies in the late 50s and through the 60s that were basically focused on the management of the government labs and control of research. Really what they were trying to do was to consolidate and close some labs. Now, what happened was, even one of the early studies actually recommended that all the military labs be pulled up into the Department of Defense under one leader. That didn't happen, but the Navy did something similar in the 60s when they pulled all the labs out of the bureaus and put them under the Director of Naval Laboratories. When Barney Smith came in 1964 to replace Russell Dane, the technical director, he said that there were some hints that Dahlgren was going to be closed. And he thought it wasn't right that he was sent to Dahlgren to officiate at a proper burial. And there were additional studies through the 80s and into the 90s. Interestingly, the studies at the beginning of the 80s accepted that there was a need for for military labs in general. And what they were focused on was efficiency and effectiveness, or as they put it, making it run more like a business. By the end of the 80s and the early 90s, the question had turned again to, do we need military laboratories? What is their role if we do? There was even discussion of privatizing military laboratories in the early 90s. It didn't go anywhere, but that was a discussion. In the late 80s, Congress passed the first Base Realignment and Closure Act, and the first BRAC study was done in 1988. When Congress went back and looked at the results, it didn't work like they wanted it to work. So they changed the law, and there were 3 more rounds in 91, 93, and 95. So there was and it was reauthorized in 2005. When they stepped back after the 95 round, again, it didn't do it quite what they wanted. The process had worked within the services, and there had not been a look at duplication across service lines. So they did a couple of more studies in the late 90s to look at that. And one of the studies in particular that I worked on was a very complicated data gathering study. It basically collapsed under its own weight without coming to any without coming to any conclusions. So that raises the question: in spite of all these challenges, Dahlgren's trajectory, especially in the last 60 years, has been generally upward. Now, how do you explain that? Well, my explanation is leadership, and we'll talk about that some. And some of the first decisions that were made that affected Dahlgren weren't made in Dahlgren. When there was the process of establishing Dahlgren, Rear Admiral Ralph Earl, who was the chief of the Bureau of Ordnance, did some legislative magic to go around backs of Stevens and Mudd and get money to open Dahlgren. Didn't make friends, but he got Dahlgren open. There was also several examples of work and staff being sent to Dahlgren. Now these examples make you wonder, it was sold as an auxiliary test range, but when you look at what actually happened almost from the beginning, you wonder if that was just a cover story. The Bureau of Ordnance had something else in mind all along. Of course, they were smart enough not to document it, so you can't ever prove it, but it certainly feels like it. Well, for example, in 1919, an aviation detachment was established at Dahlgren, so they could test aviation ordnance like bombs. Carl Norden was sent to Dahlgren in 1919 to work on unmanned radio-controlled aircraft, and in 1924 to work on his bomb sight. An officer at the Bureau of Ordnance also thought Dahlgren needed a research capability, and he persuaded Dr. L.T.E. Thompson, a physics professor, to come to Dahlgren to establish a capability, which became the Armor and Projectile Laboratory. Now, all of those things that happened in the 20s basically paid big dividends during World War II. The Norden bomb sight, for example, Carl Norden worked on variations of it in 1924. Its final version in 1932, which Mark 15 was the one that was used by the Army Air Force primarily, went into production. Every bomb sight that he made came to Dahlgren for testing, but before going to the Navy or the Army Air Force. Now, that changed in the summer of 1942 because they needed more throughput. So Dahlgren started testing 10% of the bomb sites at that point. Dahlgren also established a bomb sight mechanics school at Dahlgren in the 30s. And they did continuing work on upgrading bomb sites, evaluating foreign bomb sites. All sorts of work came out of that. When ships building started in earnest in the late 30s, armor was a big issue, and the Armor and Projectile Laboratory had an important role to play. The armor was made by the steel plants, but they would send samples to Dahlgren for testing to see that they met the Navy's requirements. And the Armor and Projectile Laboratory would certainly share the testing results, but they were also doing research, and they would share their research to make sure that the steel plants could make the armor that the Navy needed. A third one was the variable time or proximity fuse. The director of testing at Dahlgren, Commander Deke Parsons, was sent to Washington to work on the fuse, and when it was, and he led all the testing at Dahlgren and on shipboard. When it went into production, Dahlgren did statistical testing of about 10% of the fuses before they went to the fleet. So all those investments in the 20s and 30s really paid off during World War II. One of the bigger things that happened at the end of World War, I'm coming ahead of myself. Leadership in Navy left has always been two-headed. The commander is the commanding officer is in charge by U.S. code. He has certain legal obligations and responsibilities that don't fall on the civilian leadership. So Tom Clare, when he was the TD, I heard him say numerous times that he and the CEO were equal, but the captain had 51% of the vote, and that's sort of the way it worked. But generally, the commanding officer wasn't technical. Not always true, but it was back then more than it is now sometimes. And the commanding officer would defer technical leadership to a senior civilian, what we would call a technical director these days. Now, there would be the two-headed nature could lead to tension, and it did. And there was tension at Dahlgren during World War II when Captain David Hedrick came to Dahlgren as commanding officer in spring of 1942. He and Dr. Thompson disagreed on what Dahlgren's primary contribution to the war effort could be. Captain Hedrick thought it was testing. Thompson obviously thought that research had a part to play. And Captain Hedrick tried to undercut the Armor and Projectile Laboratory and tried to get rid of Dr. Thompson. He was partly successful. Dr. Thompson did leave. But his successors, by the end of World War II, the Armor and Projectile Laboratory was twice the size it had been at the beginning of the war. So it was partly successful, I guess. One of the big decisions that was made, the Navy was working at Harvard with Dr. Aiken on developing a computer. The decision was made to send Navy's first computer to Dahlgren in 1948, the Aiken Relay Calculator Mark II, and that's a picture of it there on the left. So that came here, and that actually was the cornerstone in a lot of Dahlgren's future development, was getting that computer in 1948. Yeah, but that wasn't the end of it either. There were a lot of significant decisions made in the 50s and 60s. Russ Ledane, at the end of World War II, was the head of the Armor and Projectile Laboratory. And he and Dr. Charles Bramble title was Director of Research. Now he would be the technical director. They read the tea leaves and saw that testing work was declining, and thought that Dahlgren had to diversify their work if they were going to survive. Now, there was a little bit of an upsurge during Korea, and then again during Vietnam. It never reached World War II levels. They were fundamentally right that testing was going to be a limiting field to be in if that's all you did. So their first challenge was to reshape the workforce, and that was complicated by the fact that there were hiring restrictions after World War II. So they couldn't just go and hire. So their strategy was when technicians left or retired, they replaced them with college-educated scientists and engineers. It was a slow process to reshape the workforce, but it worked eventually. The next thing they had to do was to get different work. Once they had the workforce that they could sell, they had to get different work. And so so the technical directors and other senior scientists went to work regularly at the Pentagon, program offices, the bureaus, trying to get work. Now, I didn't endear them to the other Navy laboratories. They accused Dahlgren of job shopping, and even worse, of trying to poach their work. But they were successful. In the late 50s, they got part of the Polaris program, submarine launched ballistic missile program, and HERO, hazards of electromagnetic radiation to ordnance, both in the late 50s, and both are still at Dahlgren now. And it's still an important program. It's not the biggest anymore, they're still an important program. So they also built this building on the left, the first modern office building on the base at Dahlgren and computer center, built in 1200. It was they strategically put it near the main gate. VIPs, when they had come to visit Dahlgren, had typically gone to the range. Now they'd come to the gate and see this orange building sitting across the field, and they had to go see the new computer center. That became the first stop on the VIP tour. So it was a very strategic placement and a sales job in a way. One of the big things that happened in 1955 that let Dahlgren go and get some of these new pieces of work was Navy had been working on its first supercomputer, the Naval Ordnance Research Calculator. There was a lot of competition between the Navy labs and even the Energy Lab in Lawrence Livermore about where this computer was going to go. And in 1955, the decision was made to send it to Dahlgren. So getting that computer really set the groundwork for some of the Polaris work and things like that, and a lot of things that came after. Now, in 1964, Russell Dane left to go to GE in Schenectady, and Barney Smith became the technical director. Now, Barney continued some of the things that Russell Dane had done, but he also did some things of his own. He brought in senior leaders like Jim Colvard from outside of Dahlgren because he wanted a senior staff that knew what he was trying to do, and he wasn't convinced that the people at Dahlgren at the time really were on board with it. He also continued, he changed management processes. He focused on a lot of workforce development, the junior professional development program and academic fellowship program, both of which benefited me greatly, were Barney's thing. And so he did an awful lot. Now, Barney Smith and Russell Dane basically transformed Dahlgren, were proving ground to a laboratory. And that included a name change in 1959. Again, as part of the publicity, they changed the Naval Proving Ground to the Naval Weapons Laboratory, giving a sign that Dahlgren is not what it used to be. It may not have been quite what it's going to be, but it wasn't what it used to be either. The technical directors who followed Barney, Jim Colvard succeeded Barney Smith, the technical director. And Tom Clare came in the early 90s. Both of them continued the move of Dahlgren to being a systems engineering center. And Jim brought in some new programs like Aegis ship self-defense and Tomahawk cruise missile work, both of which have become very important to Dahlgren. Jim also managed the merger of the Naval Ordnance Lab at White Oak and the Naval Weapons Lab at Dahlgren to be the Naval Surface Weapons Center, which very quickly became the Naval Surface Warfare Center.
Well,
Tom Clare had a similar thing. He led Dahlgren with the incorporation of the Postal Systems Station at Panama City as part of Dahlgren. And then later in the 90s, the incorporation of the naval activity in Dam Neck, Virginia, as part of Dahlgren. And Tom successfully led Dahlgren through 3 rounds of BRAC. So, all the technical directors, I knew all of them starting with Barney Smith, but all the technical directors had a major role in Dahlgren's growth. Now it's interesting that Dahlgren's growth wasn't just Naval Proving Ground and all its names that came after, it was the base in general. Over the years, Dahlgren's capabilities attracted other commands to the base. First probably being Naval Space Surveillance came in 1960. It later became the Naval Space Command, and when that was disestablished, that same job was being done by a detachment of the Air Force and Naval Space Force. So that work still continues. In 1984, the Aegis Training and Readiness Center, the Navy schoolhouse for Aegis sailors, came to Dahlgren. Partly because the Aegis work was here, and there's also a possibility with basically military instructors and students and civilian engineers next door working on it, that there were some opportunities to benefit from each other. There's another example where Dahlgren actually created new commands. One of the Dahlgren departments did some special targeting work during a Desert Storm, and afterwards people look at it and said, that's not proper work for a Navy 11 to be doing. And they created the Joint Warfare Analysis Center, JWAC, at Dahlgren to do the work that had actually been a part of the Dahlgren department. And that Joint Command is, of course, still at Dahlgren, one of the bigger ones. There were also organizational changes in 2005. Up to 2005, the commander of the Naval Proving Ground and all its subsequent names was also the base commander. In 2005, the base became Naval Support Facility Dahlgren under the Naval District of Washington. And the commander of Naval Support Facility Dahlgren is the base commander. Naval Service Warfare Center, Dahlgren Division, became a tenant. One of 12 or 14, and far and away the biggest. but they have to work with 2 different commands. So, brings me back to my question: was Dahlgren's growth inevitable? I think maybe a little bit, but there are other factors that are much more important. Beginning with geography, Dahlgren, Indian Head, and Washington Navy are all on the Potomac River, and in relatively close proximity to one another. And in the 20s and 30s, most of the travel between them was done on the river. The roads were horrible. So and the Dahlgren actually had 2 ferries. Well, there were 2 ferries that were dedicated to moving people up and down the river between Dahlgren and again the Navy Yard in the 30s. And so it was so geography, 50-mile range in Dahlgren was an advantage as well. The range actually goes all the way to the Chesapeake Bay. Now, Dahlgren typically has used the upper 20 miles. The longest shot we can find on record was 27 miles. But the range is technically 50 miles long. Now, I think one of the big things that Dahlgren did, though, is that Dahlgren's leaders kept abreast of the changing needs of the Navy and changed capabilities to be able to meet those changing needs. That wasn't true of a lot of other laboratories. And I also had the advantage for Dahlgren when things like base realignment and closure came along. Dahlgren had advocates further up the chain of command. Where Dahlgren was prohibited from doing certain things, they had advocacy in the room, and Dahlgren couldn't be there. Again, that wasn't always true of the other laboratories, but that was a big deal. So I always look at it visionary leadership, as well as making sure you always had a qualified staff. Now, we always like this picture of John Warner Senator Warner visiting Dahlgren in 2004. I always like to point out to my friend Captain Joe McGettigan on the right that there are more VMI guys in that picture than there are Naval Academy guys. Because Jeff and I on the back row are both VMI graduates. Senator Warner, when he was making the visit, described Dahlgren as one of the crown jewels of American defense. Well, It's been a long journey from auxiliary test range to Crown Jewel. But Dahlgren is still moving into the future. Dahlgren is still looking at the Navy's evolving needs. It's still developing capabilities to address them. And I just listed a few of them. They're directed energy weapons, artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, cybersecurity. Dahlgren is leading all of those efforts in some way or another to make sure they're still relevant to the Navy in the future. Got any questions? I'm glad to.
So of all the leaders that have been at Dahlgren, who do you think was the most impactful?
I think the one we were fortunate to have at the time he was probably Russ Ledane. Now I know his daughter and his son, but I never knew him. He was gone before I came to Dahlgren. But I just looked at the time he was here during World War II in the Armored Projectile Laboratory, what he did after as technical director. There was a huge changes made in the late 40s through the 50s. He was at the head of a lot of that. Now, Barney Smith, but I wouldn't put Barney Smith very far behind. He did a lot of things with workforce. And I personally knew Jim Colbart and Tom Clare and some others and thought highly of all of them, but I think I'd say Russ Ledane.
Was the base always known as Dahlgren?
Well, when in 1918, when they bought the land, they came and they were trying to decide what to call it. The town such as it was not Dahlgren, and so they first wanted to do Machotic Creek Post Office, but that was somebody had already taken that. So Admiral Earl got the idea that it ought to be named after John Dahlgren, the father of naval ordnance. And so he went to the Secretary of the Navy, he went to the postmaster to get the name of the post office, Dahlgren. And since the post office was Dahlgren, the base has sort of become known as Dahlgren. Like the post office came first.
One thing that's interesting, people around so often coming to King George think of Dahlgren as a town, a separate almost entity from King George. This is Dahlgren.
I know. Well, we live in Dahlgren, go to church up here by the courthouse, and trying to get people to go from one end of the county to another can be a real challenge. People who live up here think Dahlgren, down there somewhere.
Yeah.
Dan, if you're a tourist coming into King George and you're walking around through there, is Dahlgren the
speaker right now.
facility that's open to the public?
Dahlgren was an integral part of the community until 9/11. And basically, people used the theater, used the golf course, used the gym. After 9/11, it tightened up considerably. And now you have to have ID, you have to have a reason to go on the base. It's basically generally closed off. Now, the Dahlgren Heritage Museum, we do monthly base tours on Saturday. So we can do a bus tour of the base with their permission. But basically, you just can't go on. If you have a military ID to go to the exchange or the commissary, you can do that, but if you don't have the ID, you basically can't get on the base very easily.
Wouldn't they sell off the housing that was there on Dahlgren on the street?
What?
They sold off the housing in Dahlgren.
Well, actually, what happened when they expanded the base in the late 30s out to 301, the first base was the central part right where the main range is. In the 1930s, they expanded it, actually across 301 to where Air Museum is, because that's still federal land. But the base, when they expanded it towards 301, there was a thriving black community there with stores and ball team and baseball field. They farmed and trapped muskrat and fish. And basically when they took the land over, the houses that could be moved were moved off the base on Potomac Drive between B Gate and the stoplight. A lot of them couldn't be moved, and they just stayed in place in the woods until they fell down. Now, they gave the residents who lived there, they gave them permission to fish and hunt until late 30s when World War II was coming. Then they sort of closed that down. But a lot of the houses that were on that part of, that were African American, basically, either a handful got moved, but most of them were still down in place.
If you looked at the geography of the base, whether any of the impacts of future change in climate, water things or whatever.
No, I haven't. No, I haven't. I know there've been some suits about the stuff Dahlgren has fired into the river over the years, and what that might, and what the effect of all that metal might be, but I haven't looked into it very much. I was part of an environmental impact study at Dahlgren years and years and years ago, and I've seen some of the reports, but nothing much came from that.
Anybody else? Thank you, Dr. Gates. Appreciate it.